Under the sterile glow of Fort Braxton's commissary lights, Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan moved quietly through the aisles, her steps slow but deliberate. At 52, she carried herself not like a retiree clinging to memories, but like a soldier who still calculated exits with every glance. Her military jacket, olive drab and softened with age, hung on her shoulders like second skin. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, creased at the elbows, and carried one silent detail that most overlooked: a ghost-shaped outline where a unit patch had once been long since removed. But for those who knew, that outline meant one thing: secrets. To most, she was just another aging veteran. To two young lieutenants standing near the deli, she was a joke. "Check out that jacket," Lieutenant Andrew Mercer whispered with a smirk. His crisp uniform looked fresh from inspection. "I bet she bought that from a thrift store." Lieutenant Ryan Foster laughed softly. "Probably tells stories about battles she watched on TV. Look at her, old and forgotten." Lex heard them. She always heard. She didn't turn, she didn't flinch. She simply placed a bag of apples into her cart, her gloved fingers steady as stone, and kept moving forward. After 23 years of classified service mockery from boys who hadn't yet bled, didn't register. But that didn't stop them. Mercer stepped closer as Lex approached the checkout. "You know they really should crack down on stolen valor around here." Foster chuckled. "Agreed. I mean, anyone can buy an old jacket and act tough." Lex stood silently in line. Beside her, Corporal Olivia Chang, the young cashier, glanced nervously between the hardened woman and the officers, sensing tension she didn't understand. "Military discount?" Chang asked automatically. "Yes, please," Lex answered, voice low calm. She slid her military ID forward. The scanner beeped. Chang frowned. "Ma'am, I'm getting a restricted access alert on your ID." That's when Mercer's grin widened. "Restricted, huh? What are you hiding?" Foster leaned forward, eyes flashing, trying to cheat the system lady. In that moment, Lex stood at the center of the commissary as silence bloomed. Shoppers turned, phones came out. The two young officers stood proud, loud, and utterly unaware of the truth. Captain Alexandra Morgan said nothing. She'd spent 2 decades risking her life for missions no one would ever know. Missions that bought these men the right to mock her. And now, as her identity hung behind a classified firewall, she found herself unable to say the only words that mattered: "I earned every thread of this jacket." Instead, she simply waited as judgment fell like gunfire around her. The war she couldn't speak of had come home, and no one knew. Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan pushed her cart through the commissary exit, groceries bagged in silence, the stares of strangers following her like a scar. Behind her, Lieutenants Mercer and Foster watched smugly as their video continued circulating among base personnel. Within the hour, Lex Morgan had become an unwilling subject of base gossip, a suspected fraud. By the time Lex returned to her small apartment off base, she already knew. She didn't need social media to tell her what she'd seen in their eyes: doubt, disrespect, disbelief. She set the groceries on her counter and sat in the silence, staring at her faded jacket folded neatly over the nearest chair. The ghost outline of her Spectre Group patch caught the sunlight, a shadow of a past no one was allowed to know. Elsewhere on Fort Braxton, a very different conversation had begun. In the operations office, Captain Ryan Hammer Davis frowned at his phone screen. He watched the video twice, then a third time. His expression darkened. His own time in Special Forces gave him a dangerous instinct for details, and in this video, one detail was all he needed. Rossi Davis barked into his phone. "Sir," came the voice of First Sergeant Isabel Rossi, her tone sharp and professional. "I need your eyes on something." Minutes later, in a back room at the non-commissioned officer's office, the video played on a secured screen. Rossi leaned in, her experienced eyes locking onto the same feature Davis had spotted: the faint outline above Lex's left chest, nearly invisible to untrained eyes. "I'll be damned," Rossi whispered. "That's Spectre." "Thought so," Davis muttered grimly. They both knew the weight of what they'd found. "Spectre Group," a unit whispered about even in Black Ops circles. Unacknowledged, unofficial, disavowed, and dead as far as public record was concerned. "Who is she?" Rossi asked. Davis scrolled back through base logs. "Morgan, Captain Alexandra Morgan." Rossi's face changed instantly. Recognition, respect, and something colder: fear. That woman saved entire units in operations we're not allowed to name. I've heard her code name in briefings we weren't even allowed to admit attending. Apparently, 2 lieutenants didn't get the memo, Davis said tightly. Word moved fast. Senior NCO networks, the quiet veins of military communication, pulsed with the truth. Names were withheld, but respect spread like wildfire. The story of what Mercer and Foster had done, publicly humiliating a Spectre veteran, was no longer a joke. It was a scandal. By late afternoon, texts and calls reached every corner of the base. Davis took point. Get word to the command sergeant major. I'm not letting this slide. Meanwhile, in her apartment, Lex sat staring at her service photo, one of the few remnants not marked classified. She remembered when that photograph had been taken, 2002, before Tyran Province, before the mission they buried, before 4 of her team had died nameless. The knock on her door came just after sunset. Lex opened it to find First Sergeant Rossi standing at attention. Ma'am, Rossi said respectfully, permission to speak freely. Lex nodded, confused. On behalf of every soldier who's ever worked in shadows we weren't allowed to name, I wanted to apologize for what happened today. Lex's throat tightened. You know, I know enough. Behind Rossi, Captain Davis stepped forward. We're not here to ask what you did, Captain Morgan. We're here to thank you for doing it. Lex's composure cracked for a moment. She'd lived 2 decades unseen. Suddenly her own were standing before her. You don't have to. We do. Davis interrupted gently. Rossi's voice lowered. Ma'am, Base Command knows. The junior officer's video hit the wrong inboxes. Higher-ups recognized that patch. You're not invisible anymore. Lex's silence wasn't fear, it was disbelief. What now? She asked softly. Rossi hesitated. We'll handle them. The lieutenants, and... Someone else is coming. Lex frowned. Davis answered the unspoken question. General Robert Trent. At that, Lex's legs nearly gave out. General Trent was the officer who had classified Spectre Group, who had signed the denials, who had buried their dead in silence. Why, Lex whispered. Davis met her gaze, his voice grim, because he saw the video, and because even ghosts deserve respect. Back on base, Mercer and Foster were already learning that respect the hard way. Summoned to the operations office, they found themselves face-to-face with Command Sergeant Major Patel, Captain Davis, and First Sergeant Rossi. The accusations of fraud they'd so confidently filmed were being dissected like a live grenade, but no reprimand would prepare them for what came next. Word spread. Senior staff assembled. General Trent's arrival was imminent. And in her apartment, Lex Morgan stood in silence, her fingers tracing the worn outline of the patch she'd once worn with pride. Tomorrow, the past would catch up with her. Tomorrow, after decades in shadows, she would be seen. And Fort Braxton would remember who Captain Alexandra Morgan truly was. Captain Alexandra Lex. Morgan didn't sleep. At dawn, she stood in front of her mirror staring at her reflection. Same lines, same tired eyes, same jacket, the faded Spectre Group patch still ghosting above her heart. She knew today wouldn't be like yesterday. By 0800 hours, Lex was back inside Fort Braxton's commissary, not because she wanted to return, but because she refused to be driven away. Her steps were measured, steady. Each footfall felt like defiance against every rumor that painted her as a fraud. At the entrance, she saw them. Lieutenants Mercer and Foster standing near the registers, their phones out again. Their expressions weren't smug today, they were cautious. But still they waited, ready to catch what they believed would be Lex's second humiliation. Lex ignored them. She pushed her cart forward, head high. Shoppers whispered. The video from yesterday had spread. Everywhere she moved, eyes followed. Some filled with suspicion, others with something more painful, pity. Then, without warning, Mercer stepped directly into her path. Captain Morgan, he said loudly, forcing her to stop. His voice carried down the fluorescent-lit aisles. We're still waiting for proof of your service. Lex said nothing. Her eyes locked onto his. Calm, unyielding. Lieutenant Foster raised his phone, ready to film again. Then the doors opened. Silence rippled through the commissary like a shockwave. A 4-star general in full dress uniform entered, flanked by aides. Tall, broad-shouldered. A presence that radiated command with every step. General Robert Adams. Every officer and enlisted personnel in the building stood frozen. Even Mercer lowered his phone, unsure of what was happening. Adams walked straight toward Lex. His eyes didn't flicker. His jaw was tight. His steps slowed as he approached, stopping just a few feet from her. Then, in front of every soldier and civilian in the store, General Robert Adams, the commander of U.S. Northern Command, came to rigid attention and rendered a formal salute to Captain Alexandra Morgan. Gasps echoed. Mercer stepped back as if struck. The general held the salute. Captain Morgan Adams said, his voice firm yet heavy. Spectre Group. Operation Nightfall, Tyran Province, 2002. Lex's breath caught in her throat. Adams lowered his salute, but his voice carried across every aisle. I should have saluted you 20 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Adams turned to face the stunned onlookers. His voice was strong, but laced with something unfamiliar guilt. For those who don't understand what you're witnessing, let me explain. This woman served in the most classified unit our military has ever operated, Spectre Group. Her missions were never reported, her victories never celebrated. Her sacrifices buried for political convenience, including Operation Nightfall, a mission that prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed thousands of American civilians. He looked back at Lex, and I signed the order that buried that truth. Every person in the commissary, Mercer Foster, the senior NCOs gathering near the entrance, even the civilian shoppers stood frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. Adams's voice cracked. I erased your service, Captain, and the service of 4 teammates who never came home. I denied their families the truth, for politics, for deniability, for reasons I can no longer justify. He took a breath. I came here today to do what I should have done 20 years ago. He faced Lex fully now. On behalf of the United States Army, I apologize. Lex's vision blurred, not from shame, but from the weight lifting too heavy too long carried alone. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but steady. I didn't come here for apologies, General. Adams nodded. I know, but you're getting one. He continued addressing everyone. Effective immediately, Captain Alexandra Morgan's full service record will be restored. Her awards and honors will be officially recognized. And her fallen teammates, Sergeant Daniel Kim, Corporal Maria Chen, Specialist Eric Walsh, and Private First Class Sarah Rodriguez will receive posthumous honors for their sacrifice during Operation Nightfall. The general's gaze swept across the room. And for every soldier present, let this be a reminder, not every hero wears visible scars, and not every service is meant to be known. Mercer looked pale. Foster lowered his phone, shamed into silence. Adams turned back to Lex. I can't give you back those years, Captain, but I can give you back your name. Lex hesitated for a long moment. Then slowly she extended her hand. Adams shook it. Applause erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of a military ceremony. It was raw, genuine. Senior NCOs, officers, enlisted personnel, and civilians all stood together applauding not a general, but the quiet woman who'd shopped unnoticed among them for years. As Lex stood there for the first time in decades, the weight of invisibility cracked. Captain Alexandra Morgan was no longer a ghost, and Fort Braxton would never forget her again. 3 weeks after the day General Adams saluted her, Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan stood at parade rest on the main stage of Fort Braxton's Grand Assembly Hall. The room was packed. Rows of uniforms filled every seat. Marines, soldiers, airmen, even civilians. Veterans who had served in silence lined the back walls. Lex could feel their presence as sharply as if standing beside them. At the front, the banners of the United States Army hung beside the Spectre Group insignia, officially restored after 2 decades in the shadows. A black shield with silver wings, once erased from every database, now displayed proudly for all to see. But Lex wasn't here for herself. She stood for the 4 who couldn't. General Robert Adams approached the podium. His voice, steady and ceremonial, filled the hall. Today we honor service that was denied recognition for far too long. We restore history that was deliberately erased. We honor the quiet warriors who carried burdens without medals and whose names were whispered only in classified briefings. He turned to Lex. Captain Morgan stepped forward. Lex obeyed silently. Her faded Spectre Group patch had been freshly restored, but she still wore her old olive jacket. When Adams presented her medals, the Distinguished Service, Cross the Silver Star, and 3 Purple Hearts, the ribbons gleamed against her uniform's worn fabric. Adams pinned each medal in silence. For a moment, Lex felt the unbearable weight of what those awards represented. Pain, loss, sacrifice. General Adams stepped back, letting the applause fill the silence. The hall erupted, but Lex's expression didn't change. When Adams motioned for her to speak, she approached the podium slowly, medals heavy against her chest. She stood in silence for several long seconds. Then her voice, calm, deliberate, echoed across the packed auditorium. "I accept these honors, not for myself." She looked to the specter insignia behind her, and her voice tightened. "I accept them for Sergeant Daniel Kim, Corporal Maria Chen, Specialist Eric Walsh, and Private First Class Sarah Rodriguez, my team." The crowd grew still. They died in Tiram Province 22 years ago. Their families were told it was a training accident. I watched their lives reduced to footnotes in sealed reports. Her voice didn't waver. They were warriors, leaders, human beings. And their silence ends today. Every veteran in the audience stood. Lex glanced down briefly, forcing the memories to settle. "I don't need the world to remember me, but I'll spend every breath I have ensuring it remembers them." Her hands gripped the podium. Real leadership isn't about standing on stages like this. It's about standing beside your people when it matters most. It's about carrying their names forward when they can't speak for themselves. She let her words sink in. "And if you want to honor me, then honor them. Live like they did. Serve like they did." She looked out across the sea of faces. "And never forget who didn't come home." Lex stepped back. She said nothing else. The silence was heavier than applause could ever be. Adams rejoined her at center stage as the names of her fallen team members were read aloud. One by one, their families who had flown in from across the country stood to receive posthumous medals presented with trembling hands. For many, tears flowed freely. This time, the families knew the truth. Lex stood with them, a quiet pillar, as the medals were placed into their hands, and whispered their loved ones' names softly to each. When the ceremony ended, General Adams leaned toward her. "You saved their memories." Lex shook her head. "They saved mine." Later that evening, back in the now quiet assembly hall, Lex remained seated, medals resting beside her, lost in thought. She didn't notice Mercer and Foster approach. The two lieutenants who had once mocked her stood hesitantly behind her chair. Man Mercer's voice cracked slightly. Lex turned slowly, studying them. Neither man could meet her eyes. Foster spoke next. "We're sorry." Lex said nothing. She waited. Mercer's voice broke. "We didn't understand. We didn't see." Foster looked up, eyes glassy. "We want to be better leaders. We're asking if you'd be willing to teach us." Lex held their gaze for a long moment. "You don't owe me an apology," she said softly. "You owe it to the people you'll lead one day." Mercer swallowed hard. "Please, we're ready to learn." For the first time in weeks, Lex allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "Then meet me tomorrow, 0600, training field." Both officers straightened instinctively. "Yes, ma'am." As they turned to leave, Lex looked down at the medals beside her. Her war wasn't over, but perhaps her purpose had changed. She wasn't finished yet. Tomorrow she would teach, not for herself, but for Kim Chen Walsh and Rodriguez. Their names would never fade again, and that was all the honor she needed. Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan never sought recognition, but after the ceremony, her life quietly transformed. The base that once questioned her now looked to her as a teacher. Each morning at precisely 0600, she stood at the training field not as a decorated war hero, but as a mentor. Mercer Foster and dozens of other young officers listened as Lex taught them what leadership truly meant. She didn't speak of classified missions or medals. Instead, she spoke of sacrifice, of humility, of carrying responsibility even when no one saw or thanked you. Her faded jacket, once mocked as surplus store clothing, became a symbol across Fort Braxton. To those who wore new uniforms, it represented something deeper, the sacrifices made by those who could never speak of them. Her Spectre Group patch, restored and worn with quiet pride, reminded every soldier who passed her that hidden battles mattered just as much as those reported in headlines. But Lex's greatest victory came not from medals or formations. It came when she stood beside the families of Kim Chen Walsh and Rodriguez, finally able to share the truth about their loved ones. No longer hidden behind classified files, their names now echoed through memorial halls and living rooms alike. Their families found peace knowing their sacrifice had not been erased. Over time, Lex's story spread throughout the military. Bases across the country used her experience as a lesson in respect and humility. Soldiers and officers alike were reminded every veteran carries battles you may never understand. Behind every faded jacket, every silent salute could stand a hero who sacrificed more than you'll ever know. And so Captain Lex Morgan led one final mission. Not in the shadows, but in daylight, teaching a new generation that true leadership isn't about glory, it's about honor. And now to you, the listener, carry this lesson forward. Respect those who walk quietly among us. They may be carrying the weight of sacrifices you'll never see. If this story moved you, honor their silence. Leave a comment below about someone you admire. And if you believe stories like Lex's deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel for more real stories that prove true. Heroes don't need to speak loudly to change the world, because sometimes quiet leadership echoes the loudest.